I am Maya, a ceramic artist who grew up being overlooked. After my 24th birthday, when the gift I bought for myself was yanked out of my hands by my parents and handed to my sister Chloe with a cold, "You don't deserve anything." I left home for Chicago and rebuilt my life with a steady job, my work in a gallery, a small house of my own, and clear boundaries. Then, one day, they showed up, demanding I give my house to your sister because she was pregnant. Sounds ridiculous, right? What they did next was even more shameless. But here's what they didn't know. I'm not the girl I used to be. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I asked them to sit down, and for the first time they had to listen. To get to that moment, I have to start from my childhood in a 2-story house with a white fence in the suburbs of Hartford. Everything looked proper from the outside, and inside my parents, Mark and Laura, held tightly to a certain kind of order. A good child was the kind who made others proud. I was the eldest, quiet and obsessed with clay. My younger sister Chloe was bright and knew how to smile at the right times. One day, I stood on a chair to straighten the family photo. The frame slipped off the hook and fell with a clatter. The glass cracked. Mum turned around. "What are you doing?" "Don't touch that again." The doorbell rang. Her friend walked in. Laura proudly said Chloe could read early, then turned to me. "Go get her coat." I nodded, backed into the hallway, and learned how to disappear when needed. That evening at dinner, Dad noticed a streak of dry clay under my nails. "Go wash your hands again. The dinner table's no place for that stuff." When I returned, the conversation had already shifted to Chloe's activities. I tried to tell them about my first bowl. Dad, cut in curtly, "Those things won't get you into a good school. Put them away starting tomorrow, focus on math." I nodded. I nodded because arguing was pointless. The only place I was ever in the centre of the frame was in Grandma June's sunny kitchen. The air smelled like cinnamon waffles, a small radio played music, and there was a low, spinning table just my height. She placed her hand over mine. "Hold it firm and slow, the clay will follow." When the little bowl finally stood on its own, she wiped the counter and placed it right in the centre. The bowl touched the wooden surface with a soft tap. "Just right," she said. I felt calm returning to me. I brought a small vase home to give Mum, hoping she'd use it for lilies. She said, "Let's just leave it here for now," then slid it into a corner, making room in the centre of the room for a new framed photo of Chloe. Chloe leaned close to my ear and whispered, "You should leave it at Grandma's. It doesn't fit here." I didn't answer. The next day, I made another bowl and took it to Grandma's. She didn't talk about right or wrong. She simply moved her spice jars aside, making space for what I made. At my parents' house, I learned to shift aside so the picture looked balanced. At Grandma's house, I stood upright in the sun hands covered in clay, asking no one for permission. Whenever I couldn't speak, I wrote in a notebook. At first, the sentences were short. Why do I always have to wait? If there were no Chloe to compare me to, would I be seen? Does anyone actually look at what I make? I never sent those questions anywhere. I wrote them to remind myself that I wasn't imagining it. I also remember one evening when Mum invited a few colleagues over. She talked endlessly about Chloe's achievements. When someone asked what I was up to, Mum smiled and said, "She makes pottery for fun." I smiled politely and walked past with a tray of drinks. That night, I went to Grandma's and saw my bowl still in the centre of the shelf. I no longer doubted my feelings. Once Grandma quietly asked, "What if your parents want you to stop for a while?" I shook my head. "No." She nodded, turned the music up a notch. Another time, while helping her clean out a cabinet, I found an old envelope tucked behind a photo of Dad as a boy. I slid my fingers along the edge of the paper, but then heard footsteps in the hallway and froze. I slipped the envelope into my pocket. Not today. I went through many days like that. Chloe cried. Mum rushed to her. I asked for scissors. Dad told me to wait. In front of the camera, I stepped back a little to make the composition look better. But when I was at Grandma's, I stood right in the centre and pressed the button on the pottery wheel. I didn't wait for anyone to give me permission to exist. I simply kept going. The small things? A cracked glass frame, the clink of a bowl placed at the centre of the shelf. The words, "Let's just leave it here for now." The order put it away, they all added up to one truth at home. I was always the one who stepped aside, but that didn't make me a permanent victim. It only taught me when to stay quiet and when to say exactly the right thing. One day I'll be able to say, "That's enough," without having to shout. For now, I'm learning to place my hands firm and slow so the clay will follow. I let the scent of clay linger on my hands a little longer before washing it off as a reminder that I carry something no one can push aside. And when a new photo is hung, I still move over to one side, but I know somewhere there is a bowl I made standing right at the centre. As long as I have these two hands, I have a place to stand. But when I was 7, that place to stand wasn't in the living room of my own home. My birthday back then fit into a small cake, a few candles, and a reminder to eat quickly so we can clean up. No friends were invited. Mum said it was less hassle. The camera died just as it was turned on, and she said, "We'll do it another time." Chloe was only 3 then, sitting on Mum's lap, fingers digging into her shoulder. I bent down to blow out the candles, but Chloe leaned forward and blew first. Mum laughed. "She's so excited." Dad cut the cake, asked me a quick question about school, then shifted straight into a story about Chloe learning to read. I listened and nodded just to get through it. That night, I wrote in my notebook, "It's my birthday, but I'm standing on the edge." 3 years later, it was Chloe's turn to turn 7. The backyard was filled with balloons, her name printed big across a banner music, playing all day, neighbours coming and going non-stop. The food table stretched along a cooler full of drinks, and Mark recorded video almost the whole time like he was afraid to miss a moment. I carried a tray of water from table to table, everyone praising Chloe for being smart, quick and adorable. I stood waiting at one corner and asked to take a photo together. Dad said, "Maybe later." Later never came. When the family gathered the guests to cut the cake, adults held their glasses. Uncles and aunts filled up all the chairs, and Dad raised his glass. "Chloe is the pride of our family." Mum smiled. "Maya is gentle, she knows how to step aside for her sister." I looked around. Cutlery clinked softly against plates. I heard my voice come out clearer than usual. "Have you ever really loved me? Or am I just the shadow that makes Chloe shine brighter?" No one laughed anymore. A cousin cleared her throat. Someone leaned down to wipe the table. Mum said softly, "Don't say silly things on a happy day." A child nearby tugged their mother's hand and asked, "Why doesn't Maya have as many gifts as Chloe?" Mom brushed past the question, switched the topic to the next game. I set the tray down, took a breath, then picked it back up. I didn't want to cause a scene right in the middle of our own yard, but that question had been inside me for too long. After most of the guests had left, Mom pulled a friend aside and whispered, "Maya's practical, she knows how to make sacrifices. Chloe deserves a big day. Dad told me to gather the trash you're good at cleaning up." I did it without arguing. Chloe walked by and whispered, "Don't make it a big deal." I looked at her and said nothing. Night fell. The yard gradually emptied. I dragged the trash bags out to the porch, washed my hands, then rode my bike to Grandma's. Grandma June opened the door before I even knocked, poured me a glass of water and asked, "You okay?" I nodded and sat down. I told her briefly about the 2 birthdays, one small, one big, about the toast, and how all the praise went in only one direction. She didn't judge. She listened until the end, then asked, "What do you want to do next?" I looked toward the kitchen corner, where the bowl I made years ago still sat at the centre of the shelf. I said, "I want to make something by hand for Mom and Dad's upcoming anniversary. Something to place in the middle of the table in front of everyone. Just once, I want to see something I made at the centre." She nodded right away. "Tomorrow, We'll mix the clay, fire it this weekend. Just make a list, I'll get everything ready. I opened my notebook and wrote one clear line. Anniversary, a vase. Goal, to be in the centre of the table. I didn't want to fight for a chance to speak at some party anymore. I just wanted something I made to have a rightful place. Leaving Grandma's, I rode slowly past dark rooftops. The sound of birthday music from my house still echoed faintly, then faded. When I got home, I saw Mark and Laura clearing the last ribbons off the fence. They were tired, but satisfied. I greeted them in passing and they nodded. No one mentioned the question I had asked at the table. Maybe they thought I just misspoke. But I knew it wasn't a slip. I went straight to my room, washed my face, and looked at myself in the mirror for a while. I didn't need an apology right now. I needed a simple plan and a clear goal. Tomorrow morning, I would be at Grandma's on time. I would mix the clay shape, it smooth the edges, make sure it stood firm. I would choose a glaze that's easy on the eyes, not flashy, just clean and neat. I would let it dry fully, wait for the right moment, then fire it. I would wrap it, carefully bring it home, place it in the centre of the table, and take my seat without stepping back. I wanted to see something I made exactly where it belonged, in front of the people who always told me I should step aside. That night, I opened my notebook again and added, "This time I won't stand on the edge." I turned off the light, lay still, and listened as the house quieted down. In that calm, I knew I had chosen what I needed to do. The next morning, I arrived at Grandma June's on time. The kitchen was bright, the scent of cinnamon waffles lingering in the air, and the pottery wheel was already placed in the centre of the floor. She had set out a bowl of water, a clean towel, and a lump of clay that fit just right in my hands. "When you know what you want, your hands will move toward it," she said. I replied, "I want to make a vase that sits in the centre of the table." I washed my hands, placed the clay down, pressed firmly, and began to spin. The rim was slightly off. I stopped to adjust it. It wobbled, nearly collapsing, but I held it steady, gathered it back, and smoothed it straight. Grandma only nodded. I placed the vase on a tray to dry, wiped the table, and sat watching it for a while. In the afternoon, I chose a glaze that was light and clean. When it went into the kiln, I watched the clock. The indicator light blinked once I reached for the handle, but pulled back. The oven chimed briefly like a reminder. 5 more minutes, Grandma said. I watched the second hand tick past each mark. Right on time, I turned it off, didn't open it right away. When I did, the vase stood firm and straight. I cleaned it, wrapped it in brown paper, tied it with string. "It's enough," Grandma said. I repeated, "Enough." On the anniversary evening, I brought it to the house. Dad set the plates, Mom arranged the flowers, Chloe checked herself in the mirror. I unwrapped it and placed the vase right in the centre of the table while everyone else was still busy. I stepped back and quickly took a photo of that moment, my vase in the centre. Before the picture could save Mum, walked in and said, "The table looks nice," then reached out and moved my vase to the corner, near the wall, placing Chloe's new framed photo in the centre. "This one fits the middle better," she said, still smiling. I said calmly, "I made that vase for you and Dad." "I know, just putting it here for now," she replied quickly. Dad walked by, glanced once and said, "Be practical, sweetie. These things are nice for decoration." He lowered his voice. "Don't put handmade stuff in the middle of the table when guests are over." I let go of the back of my chair. Guests arrived, everyone said. The photo in the middle looked perfect. One woman asked, "Who gave that vase over there?" Mum answered right away, "Old piece, just for corner decoration." I heard the word corner clearly. Dad called the family to take pictures around the table. I stepped into the frame, looked at the empty space in the centre where Chloe's frame sat perfectly. My vase was outside the photo's edge, hidden by the wall. I stepped closer to my parents and spoke just loud enough for them to hear. "Have you ever really looked at what I make, or only to find where to replace it?" Mum forced a smile. Don't make a big deal on a happy day. I nodded, didn't argue. The meal passed like that. Guests praised the food, praised the decor. I watched the adults walk past the hems of their clothes, brushing lightly against the vase's rim every time they pulled out a chair. When people stood up, I circled back, picked up the vase and wrapped it carefully. Chloe caught me in the hallway and whispered, "Don't be mad. Mum's tired." I replied plainly, I'm speaking softly, and I'm taking what's mine back. I placed a small note where the vase had stood, taken back. No one would read it, but I needed to mark it. I carried the package to the car, drove straight to Grandma's. She opened the door before I rang the bell, stepped back to let me in. I unwrapped the vase and placed it back on the kitchen shelf. It touched the wood with a clear sound. Grandma moved 2 spice jars aside. "Just right," she said. I exhaled. Here it was seen. I didn't need applause. I needed the right place. I washed my hands, then helped her clean the lower cabinet. Behind an old photo of Dad as a boy, I found a faded envelope. I slid my fingers along the paper's edge and glimpsed the name in the corner, Mark Ellis. Footsteps in the hallway made me freeze. "Not today," I whispered, tucking the envelope into my notebook. The sky dimmed quickly. I drove home, stood at the threshold of the living room, looking at the empty table. In the centre was still something that didn't belong to me. I no longer wanted to reclaim that space here. I would create a new place instead. My phone buzzed. Mum was reminding Chloe about her prom dress and said, "I'll take care of everything." I put my phone away, closed the notebook. Tomorrow I will stand in the middle of my own kitchen. No one will push me aside again. That morning, the phone rang. Mum spoke quickly, like reading a schedule this afternoon. We'd go pick Chloe's prom dress. It had to be the best, she would take care of everything. I just said okay and hung up. In the afternoon, the store was brightly lit with large mirrors and cheerful staff. Chloe stepped out in an expensive dress, spinning in front of the mirror. One of the staff smiled at me and said, "Could you step back a little so she can see her full reflection?" I stepped back, holding the bag. Mum glanced at the price, hesitated for half a second. "It's a bit much." Chloe bit her lip, eyes wet. "I just want a perfect night." The scanner beeped, the screen read no refunds. The staff asked, "Are you sure?" Mum nodded, swiped the card. The POS machine errored. She switched to another card and signed quickly. No one said anything. Everyone was looking at Chloe in the mirror. At the shoe counter, another beep, another receipt. Mum said, "Just put it on my card." Hair and makeup appointments were booked right away. Dad told me to hold the coats, carry the bags, and take a few pictures for Mum to see. I asked, "Could you take one of me to send to Grandma?" Mum replied. Later then, forgot as soon as Chloe called. On the ride home, I said softly, "I found a second-hand mini kiln affordable. I'll pay for most of it myself." Dad immediately said, "Wait until after prom. Kilns are noisy, not safe in the house." He leaned in and added quietly, "Don't bring up the kiln while she's still excited." Mum added, "Focus on things with a future." I turned to look out the window. At home, I opened the drawer, meaning to count the money I'd saved for the kiln. The jar was visibly emptier. Inside was a small note borrowed temporarily by Mum. No date. I took a picture, then put the jar back. When I asked, Mum said, "Down payment for the dress, I'll return it next week." No one mentioned it the following week. On prom night, string lights hung from the porch. Chloe's friends arrived. Dad pointed step back a little so the lights won't glare. I stepped back half a step. The lights came on. Chloe stood in the centre of the frame. Dad clicked away continuously. I asked for a photo with me in it. To send Grandma, Dad said, "Hold on," but then her friend's car pulled up. They all cheered and ran to the gate. That photo was never taken. Mum turned back inside and told me to fetch a hair clip. I looked at the time, held Chloe's cape so it wouldn't fall, and said, "I'm busy." Mum glanced at me, then went to get it herself. I adjusted Chloe's pin, said, "Have fun?" She nodded and smiled already, forgetting everything else. In the kitchen, Mum poured water and reminded me, "Stay home and answer the phone. Don't make noise tonight," I asked directly calmly. "Have you ever thought that maybe I want something to call my own too?" Mum looked at my hands. No boy will notice hands covered in clay. I held back and answered plainly, "I'm not making noise. I'm working." When the porch lights dimmed, I went to Grandma's. Grandma June listened to everything from the scanner beeping to the borrowed temporarily note. She said, "If they need tears to pay for things, don't compete by crying. Just do your work well." My phone buzzed. Mum messaged asking me to come watch the house so they could pick up Chloe late. I replied, "No, I'm busy." My hands didn't shake. I washed a few cups with Grandma, reset the pottery corner, checked the time. The night was quiet. On the way home, I thought about the old kiln, the missing money, the note in the jar. I wasn't expecting anyone to return what I needed. I would make up for it myself. The next morning, I circled the date of Chloe's summer camp on the calendar, underlined it twice so I wouldn't forget. I wanted to check one simple thing when she's not there. Would that house finally see me? I would step into the kitchen and say I came home to visit. If the answer was still wait, then I would understand clearly what I'd only suspected for so long. I'm ready for that. The morning Chloe left for summer camp, I brought some food to the house, knocked on the door, and said I came to visit. Laura opened the door and, before even inviting me in, asked, "When is Chloe coming back?" Then she shoved a bag of trash into my hand. "Take this to the bin for me." I was still standing at the doorway when Mark called out from the kitchen. "Hurry up," I took the trash out, came back in and placed the stew container on the kitchen table. Laura opened the cupboard, took out a store-bought tray, and said, "Save this for another day," moving my container to the bottom shelf of the fridge. Lunch was rushed. Laura talked about Chloe's camp schedule, and Mark put the camp supervisor on speakerphone, sounding much more enthusiastic than he had with me earlier. I mentioned I'd just finished making a new bowl. Mark nodded absent-mindedly and said, "Before your sister comes back, we need to repaint the fence for better photos." After eating, I washed the dishes, wiped the table, and placed the bowl I'd made on the kitchen counter. Laura passed by and moved it to the corner, saying, "Just for now," then stuck a small printed label that read, "Temporary." I took a photo and put my phone away. I didn't argue. I opened my notebook and wrote, "Even without her, I'm still on the edge." That afternoon, my phone buzzed. A cousin informed me Grandma June had been admitted to the hospital. I could hear the word emergency in the background. I grabbed my keys. Laura said, "Let me call first." I replied, "I'm going now." The hospital was nearby, and I arrived just in time to find Grandma still conscious. The nurse reminded me only 5 minutes. Grandma held my hand and asked if I was eating properly if I was still working with clay. I said yes. She squeezed my hand and reminded me, "Don't give up your place. Place your hands firm and slow, the clay will follow." I nodded, said yes, and stepped back as the nurse signalled time was up. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, the cousin called back Grandma had passed. I drove to her house, stood outside the kitchen window, where my bowl had always sat at the centre of the shelf. The door was locked, the curtains drawn. I rested my forehead against the glass for a second, then turned to prepare for the memorial. At the funeral home, Laura greeted the guests. Mark arranged the schedule. A relative read the farewell note Laura had written, mentioning how Chloe would be singing at next year's church service. Not a single word mentioned pottery. I stood still, holding the edge of the programme, answering anyone who asked that Chloe was away at camp. Her plans were fixed. After the service, someone handed me a small box. Grandma's pottery tools left for me, along with a savings certificate that would mature when I turned 21, and a handwritten note from her, "For your hands." Mark glanced at it and said, "Let's just keep it in the family pool for now." I replied calmly, The note says clearly it's for me. I took a photo of the certificate number and placed the envelope into my own bag. Mark said nothing more, just, up to you. That afternoon, I returned to Grandma's to pack a few things. A relative picked up her old rolling pin and joked, "Mind if I take this as a keepsake?" I smiled and said, "This one stays in her house," then placed it back in the drawer and closed it gently. I found my bowl exactly where it had always been, at the centre of the shelf. I stood there for a while, moved 2 spice jars aside and gently wiped the edge clean, whispering, "I'll keep going." My phone buzzed in my hand. A message from someone in the art group. Next week, the downtown gallery is accepting new works. Send us photos. Okay, I almost dropped the cloth I was holding, caught it just in time, and replied asking for the email. That night, I called my parents to let them know everything was done. Laura asked Chloe's coming back next week. "Can you help paint the fence?" I said, "I'm busy submitting work for the gallery. I'll try to arrange it, but I can't promise." There was a pause on the other end, then just, "Okay." I sat down, opened my notebook and wrote, "The test is clear." Even without Chloe, I still wasn't seen in that house, so I'll find my place somewhere else. I listed the tasks ahead. Take product photos. Write a short description, select 3 solid pieces, send the email tonight. I looked again at the photo of my bowl with the temporary label, then locked the screen. No one needs to place me in the centre. I will place myself exactly where I belong through my work. That night, I chose the 3 clearest photos, wrote a short description, took a deep breath, and hit send. I counted silently, 3, 2, 1, the send icon spun once and disappeared. In the morning, my inbox lit up with a bold line. Nadia from a gallery wanted to see the pieces in person, asking me to bring 5 to 7 items within 2 weeks. I called to reserve kiln time at the shared studio, made a task list, and packed the box in advance. On the meeting day, Nadia placed each piece under the light, turning them slowly. At the 3rd one, she shook her head. "Leave this one out. It weakens the overall feel." I swallowed, nodded, and tried to keep my breath steady. By the end of the session, she confirmed a small corner for me in next week's exhibition, advising me to briefly describe the process when talking to visitors and not to apologise for anything. I worked non-stop borrowed kiln time, cleaned every piece carefully, and printed the nameplate Maya Ellis. Before setup time, I messaged my parents the opening schedule. "I really hope you can come." The reply came quickly. "We'll definitely be there, so proud of you." On setup day, I placed 2 bowls on either side, the vase in the centre, and adjusted the lighting. The shelf wobbled slightly. 1 bowl slid 0.5 centimetre. I caught it just in time. Nadia whispered, "It's fine." I nodded and wiped the shelf's edge again. By 6:30, guests began arriving. A young mum stopped by, picked up a bowl, asked the price, then pursed her lips. "A bit pricey." I explained the time it took, how to use it, and why the rim was thicker for a better grip. She nodded. "Okay." I took it to the counter. Her card failed on the first swipe. She switched cards, the second printed the receipt. I thanked her, and my hands finally felt warm again. My phone buzzed. A message from Mum Chloe got an extra performance spot. I have to be with her. Dad's driving me. Sorry. I stared at the screen for a second, then put the phone away. Someone nearby asked, "Where are your parents?" I replied, "They're busy," then returned to the display corner to continue the conversation I had started. A middle-aged man asked for my email to receive updates about future events. Nadia stopped by and said if I had 2 more pieces next week, they could go on the gallery's open shelf where passers-by could view and buy any time. I said I'd do it. I messaged my parents. The opening went well. I sold 1 piece and was invited to add 2 more next week. Dad sent a thumbs up emoji. Mum replied, "Good. I'll drop by when I have time, then nothing else." I didn't wait further. I stood by the exit for a moment, breathed evenly. I knew something important had just happened. The buyer didn't know me, they bought, because they needed exactly what I had made, and I had held my price without apologising. On the way home, I reopened my task list, make 2 more pieces, take photos, send Nadia the schedule. I messaged a thank you to her for including me in this round. She replied, "You did great. Remember to smile and keep your process explanation short." I turned off my phone and felt calmer. I didn't want to dwell on who didn't come. I wanted to remember the moment the receipt printed the buyer's thank you and how my hand stayed steady catching the bowl before it slipped. Tomorrow, I'll return to the studio and make 2 more pieces for the open shelf. I don't need anyone to place me at the centre of a table. Tonight, the work did that for me. For my 24th birthday, I bought myself a tablet to design patterns for pottery, snapped a photo of the box on the passenger seat to remember that this was something I got for myself. I brought a bottle of wine to the family dinner, made small talk, listened as the conversation drifted toward Chloe as always. The cake had no name. I still poured wine, still smiled. Laura reached out and asked to borrow my car key to get a bag from the car, and I handed it over. From the window, I saw her bending into the passenger seat where the box had been. She came back in holding a wrapped gift box exactly the size I'd seen in the car. Mark called everyone into the living room. "Before you go, we have a little surprise." The box was placed on the table turned toward Chloe. I saw the ribbon, recognised the tape I had sealed earlier that afternoon. I snapped a photo just as the box landed in her lap, like capturing proof for myself. "Wait, that box," I started, but Mark cut me off. "You didn't deserve anything this year. Chloe needs it for her design class." Laura added, "You already have your pottery stuff. Just let her have this for now." Mark leaned in, his voice cold. "Don't place your things at the centre of the table when we have guests." Chloe looked at me for half a second, then tore the tape. The sound of ripping paper drowned everything else. She said thanks without meeting my eyes. I stood tall. "That's a gift I bought for myself." Laura replied flatly, "I saw it in your car." Mark waved it off. "Just buy another one." I didn't explain further. I slowly picked up my bag and said clearly before walking out, "From now on, don't use my things without asking." No one responded. I stepped out to the porch and closed the door behind me. In the car, I opened the photo of the box on the seat to remind myself I wasn't imagining it. The tears came and dried quickly. The screen lit up with a notification, video interview invitation from Chicago. I wiped my hands, tapped accept, chose the earliest slot, and felt as if someone had pulled me upright just in time. I opened my notes, typed out 3 tasks, and acted on them, immediately blocked Mark, Laura, and Chloe's numbers, removed them from social media, sent out 2 more applications I'd already bookmarked. Every step was smooth, my hands didn't shake. I drove home, and the quiet of my apartment helped clear my mind. I no longer wanted a place at that table. I needed a different place where I could set down what I made without it being pushed to the side. I opened my laptop, drafted an email to the second agency, attached product photos, and hit send. I added a note to Nadia at the gallery. "I'll make 2 new pieces for the open shelf next week." She replied shortly, "Got it. I'll save 2 spots." A light but firm message. I turned off my phone, washed my face, and looked at myself in the mirror long enough to confirm I wasn't someone who just got a gift taken away. I was someone who chose her own path, her own gift. My phone buzzed again. A message from Laura. "Don't be mad, I just want what's best for the family." I looked at it then, locked the screen. My boundary now is intentional. Silence those who respect it, can stay those who don't, can let me go forward. I placed a mug I'd made on the table, set my hand on its rim. Warm. I breathed evenly, then packed a few essentials in case I needed to move my notebook, a box of pottery tools, some printed photos. I looked around the small room and realised I'd been ready to leave the old place for a long time, just waiting for a push. That push had just happened on the very day that was supposed to be mine. I turned off the light and left the photo of the box on the passenger seat on the table as a quiet reminder from now on, I'll keep what's mine, hold my own space, and choose my own direction. I kept my word. I responded to the interview request, introduced myself briefly with past projects, and a clear goal design by day for a stable income pottery by night to keep my hands and mind steady. They asked what I needed to do the job well. I said a clear schedule and direct feedback. The next day, I received a job offer. I packed a few essentials, shipped the rest, and left Boston without telling anyone except my emergency contact. Chicago welcomed me with a small room in Wicker Park. The kitchen had just enough space for a mini pottery wheel. The window looked out onto a noisy street that wasn't unpleasant. I commuted via simple route, stopped by a cafe near the agency, sat for 10 minutes, then headed into the office. No one here knew I was Chloe's sister. No comparisons. I found a community pottery studio. They handed me the kiln schedule, a list of rules, and a labelled shelf. The studio owner said, "Keep your shelf clean and respect others' shelves." I replied, "I understand." I booked a weekend kiln slot, made a few pieces that fit my hands well, let them dry exactly how I wanted, and labelled the box clearly. I brought a few bowls to a small craft market. My table had only a price sign and business cards. A young mother stopped, picked one up, said fits nicely, and bought two. The organiser said I could use a longer table next time. I didn't say much, but as I tucked the small bills into my wallet, I felt a little steadier. I scheduled a session with Dr. Larson. I told her about the tablet that was taken and the birthday dinner. She nodded and said that was a boundary violation, not a misunderstanding. My assignment was to write 3 no sentences I could use that week. I wrote, "No, I'm busy. No, that's not my responsibility. No, I don't agree." I started using them gradually, beginning with small things at work and in the studio. At the agency, my manager assigned me a minor branding project. I met the deadline, kept the goal drafts, and final version clearly separated. A co-worker said I was neat and open to feedback. Paychecks came regularly, and I opened a separate account for a bigger goal, a home with room for a small studio. Nadia stayed in touch. She added 2 more of my pieces to the gallery's open shelf. Over the weekend, I received an email notification of a transfer for a bowl that had just sold. I read it 3 times, not out of doubt, but to imprint the feeling money from the exact thing I made. I began looking at homes in Ravenswood. I chose a 2-bedroom bungalow where sunlight streamed evenly into the back room. The agent handed me the key and asked what I planned to put in there. I said, "A pottery wheel." After closing the door, I stood in the empty room for a moment, took a deep breath, then sent Nadia a photo of sunlight spilling across the floor as a sign that I now had a place to work. I moved in box by box assembled shelves, hung curtains, set out a water bucket, and cleaned towels near the sink. I placed 2 of my bowls at the centre of the kitchen shelf. No one came to push them aside. I poured water, toasted myself with a small sip, then opened my notebook and wrote 3 lines. Keep the work rhythm. Open shelf on weekends. Regular therapy appointments. Wind drifted in from the window, gently lifting the new curtain. I thought a neighbour might come by soon, and I reached for the ring of keys hanging by the door. The doorbell rang. I looked outside. I thought it was a neighbour, but the car parked out front wasn't theirs. I stepped onto the porch. Mark opened the car door. First Laura followed and Chloe trailed half a step behind. They walked straight toward me like this was their house. I kept the latch half locked and said clearly, "This is my home. Please be brief." Mark pushed the door as I cracked it open and I stood in his way. He smirked. "Don't be so formal. We're family." Laura was already glancing around the living room. Small, but decent enough. "Chloe needs a stable place. You're here alone." I opened the door just wide enough for shoulder width. No more, took a step back, placed my phone on the shoe cabinet and turned on the recorder. "I'll speak for 3 minutes." No interruptions. Mark frowned, recording what I replied. So nothing's misunderstood. Laura placed a stack of papers on the table by the door, her tone soft but steering. I prepared the forms for Chloe to move in. "Let's keep this easy, we're all family." Mark extended his hand. hand over the keys. Chloe stood at the hallway threshold looking toward the back room silent. I pointed to my folder already on the shelf and read slowly, word by word, owner Maya Ellis. All bills under Maya Ellis. This is my private residence, Mark growled, ungrateful. What's a house this big for if you're alone? Your sister's going to need a crib, Laura chimed in. Family helps each other. You're used to apartments. Let her stay here for now. We'll sort it later. I spoke evenly. No, I won't sign. I won't hand over the keys. If you push further, I'll call the police. I will count to 10. Mark sneered. Who are you trying to scare? I began counting, voice steady. Laura's tears came quickly. I just want what's best for everyone. I kept counting without pause, hands still on the phone screen showing the dial pad. At 7, Chloe turned around and looked straight at Mark and Laura. This is Maya's house. Mark snapped, stay out of this. Chloe didn't move forward, but didn't take her words back. The neighbour across the fence looked over for a second, then pretended to water the plants. I finished 10 and opened the door wide toward the porch. Leave my house now. From this point on, all contact will be in writing. Anyone entering without permission, I will report. Mark muttered a curse. Laura pulled Chloe's hand, still turned to say, I'm disappointed in you. I replied, I understand. They stepped down the stairs. I locked both locks, tested the handle again. Only when the sound of the engine faded did I take my hand off the keys. My heart pounded, but my voice had held. The phone buzzed one new voicemail from Mark. This isn't over. Next time we'll talk this through properly. I saved the file, sent a short email to all three. Summary of this afternoon, you arrived unannounced. Requested keys and assigned transfer of use. I refused. This house is under my name. From now on, contact only via email or letter. No visits without prior notice. Any unauthorized entry will be reported to the police. Recording and voicemail saved. I hit send, watched the delivered status appear. The house returned to silence. I poured a glass of water, stood in the kitchen, saw both my bowls still in the centre of the shelf, untouched. The phone buzzed. A message from Chloe. Can I meet you alone, without Mum and Dad? I want to explain properly. I looked at the screen for a long time. I didn't want to reopen a door I had just shut, but I also didn't want to lump her in with them if she genuinely meant what she said. I replied, Tomorrow the cafe at the end of the street, 1 hour. Come alone. If you're more than 10 minutes late, it's cancelled. Chloe replied, I'll be there on time. I set the phone down, reopened the recorder app, checked that the file was running fine and saved it to the cloud. I sat on the chair by the window and breathed slowly. I didn't need anyone's approval. I needed them off my doorstep. Today, I did that. And for the first time, right in front of them, my sister finally said the words I needed to hear. This is Maya's house. I messaged Chloe tomorrow the cafe at the end of the street, 1 hour, no one else. I arrived early, chose a window seat so I could leave quickly if needed. When she walked in, I spoke first. One speaks, one listens. No blaming those not here. If it gets off track, we stop. Chloe nodded, holding her cup with both hands, like trying to steady herself. She spoke directly, apologised for the tablet for letting our parents speak for her yesterday. Said Mom prepared the words Dad pushed, admitted she had benefited from the favouritism and had gotten used to asking for more, said she wanted to stop. I didn't rush to comfort her. I asked 3 questions to see if she truly wanted to change. Could she refuse to let them into my house without permission? Was she willing to cover part of the costs and take on household duties? Would she accept clear timelines and consequences if broken? Chloe looked at me and said yes, but she needed a framework to follow. I pulled out a blank sheet of paper and wrote right there at the table a set of simple, measurable terms. Temporary stay for 12 weeks extension, only if both agree. No visits from our parents without prior notice, and my approval, any violation ends the arrangement immediately. She pays a fixed weekly contribution and completes chores listed on the fridge schedule. Each week, she sends me a short plan of work and savings. Even a small amount is required. After 10 p.m., maintain quiet respect. The pottery studio don't touch the tools. Attend 2 therapy or support group sessions per month. I only need confirmation she went. If she repeats a violation after 1 warning, she leaves within 48 hours. I slid the paper to her. Love still needs boundaries. Support with conditions is fair for both of us. Her phone lit up Mom on the screen. Chloe looked at me, tapped decline, and typed, "I'm busy, I'll call later." I felt my shoulders drop by half an inch. She read the agreement carefully, asked for clarity on a few points, then signed. I signed beside her. We took a photo, each kept a copy. I didn't give her the spare key yet. I said I'd hand it over after the first week if everything followed the agreement. On the way home, I emailed a summary of the terms we just signed, with the photo attached for a digital copy. Back in the kitchen, I taped the chore schedule to the fridge, dishwashing days, trash vacuuming, and added a door rule sheet: no opening the door for anyone while I'm away, all visitors must message first. Chloe set down her suitcase and asked for the Wi-Fi password. I gave it to her along with the neighbourhood emergency number. She made tea and placed 2 of my ceramic mugs in the centre of the table. This time, no one pushed them to the corner. We sat quietly for a few minutes, not forcing small talk. I said, "For the first week, all I need is for you to show up at work on time, make your payment on time, and not invite anyone over." She nodded. I can do that. I trusted just enough to begin. Night fell. Outside footsteps stopped on the porch, then moved on. My phone buzzed a new voicemail from Mark, more of the same threats, promising to come back and settle things. I saved the file, drafted a short email to all 3 titled "Boundaries at My Home," summarised their ambush, reiterated that this house is in my name, that all contact must be by email or letter, and that any violations would be reported to the police. I attached the signed agreement and CC'd Chloe. I hit send. The house fell quiet again. I looked at the paper on the table at the 2 mugs in the centre. This time the door opened because of a clear agreement, not pleading, not tears. If someone breaks the rules, the door will close again. I kept that promise by being clear and following through. In the morning, Chloe placed her weekly contribution on the tray, checked off her chores. Her phone lit up with Mom, and she declined the call, texting back, "Busy, we'll call later." I simply said, "Thank you." My phone buzzed with a voicemail from Mark, his voice threatening, saying he would come back and settle this properly. I saved the file called the non-emergency line, gave a summary, received a case number, and was instructed on how to submit a no trespass warning. Another email arrived from Mrs. Alvarez from the neighbourhood board. Someone had anonymously complained about smoke from the kiln. I replied immediately, invited her to inspect, and attached the specs of the electric kiln and its operating hours. When she came over, I showed her the back room, the dedicated outlet ventilation fan fire extinguisher, and the house rules posted on the wall. Mrs. Kim, the neighbour next door, stopped by and said there was no smell or noise despite being right next door. In the middle of all this, Laura kept calling repeatedly. Chloe silenced her phone and said firmly, "Under the house agreement, no unannounced family visits." Mrs. Alvarez nodded, took a few notes, complimented the tidy workspace, and said she'd send a confirmation letter. I printed the letter and posted a copy in the studio. In the afternoon, the doorbell rang. The camera showed Mark and Laura at the gate. I left the door locked and spoke through the speaker. "This is the final warning. You've received the boundary email and case number. No appointment, no entry. I'm counting to 5. I said 5, 4, 3. They stepped back and turned away. The neighbour across the street glanced over and continued watering her plants, a silent confirmation that everything had been seen. I saved another copy of the footage into the evidence folder. That evening, I made tea, placed 2 of my ceramic mugs at the centre of the table. Chloe handed me a small note listing her weekly savings and 2 apartments she was considering. She said she would move out after 12 weeks, whether the stay was extended or not. I gave her 2 of the no phrases I had practiced. No, this isn't my responsibility, and no, I don't open the door without notice, and asked her to say them out loud. She did. Her voice wasn't strong, but it was clear. My phone buzzed a gallery email inviting me to join a new group exhibition, requesting 2 more pieces for the open shelf. Immediately after a message from Thomas, a co-worker congratulating me and inviting me to a weekend exhibit he thought I'd enjoy. Chloe smiled and said, "Go ahead, I'll watch the house." I looked around the kitchen, the chore schedule on the fridge, the neighbourhood confirmation letter in the back room, the emails I'd sent with case numbers and agreements attached. I felt lighter, not because anyone had suddenly decided to love me more, but because my boundaries now had a voice. An email, a case number, and third-party validation. Setting boundaries hadn't made me lonely. It had just cleared space for people who know how to knock. Just as I finished that thought, there was a soft knock. I looked through the peephole. Thomas stood on the porch holding an exhibition flyer, not having messaged ahead, but still stepping back half a pace as if waiting for permission. I opened the door and said clearly, "House has rules, guests enter when invited. No photos in the studio, no touching tools." He nodded immediately. "I'll follow your rules." I poured water, pointed to the 2 bowls at the centre of the shelf, and told him I had just been invited to join a group show. He asked which part I liked talking about most. I said the rim of the bowls and how they fit just right in the hand. He listened through, didn't interrupt. On opening night, Nadia introduced me to a few guests, someone tried the feel, and decided to purchase a piece. Thomas stood nearby, but let me answer all questions about the process. He only added 1 line when I hesitated. "She makes them for daily use, so they have to be durable and fit well," then stepped back. On the way home, we stopped at a small cafe. He said he wanted to sit beside me, not in the centre of my table. I smiled, finding that just enough. At home, Chloe was waiting in the kitchen with a neatly folded sheet, her new lease-moving schedule, and the last weekly contribution for the tray. She said she'd found a place that worked close to her job, with morning light, and thanked me for the clear framework that helped her stand on her own. I gave her a brief hug, made no grand promises, and simply said, "Stick to the schedule you wrote." While rearranging the shelf, I remembered the old envelope behind the photo of Dad when he was young. I took it down and opened it. It was written in Grandma June's hand, addressed to Mark, but never passed to me. "Don't push Maya's things into the corner. If she can place what's hers at the centre of the table, leave it there. She's standing on her own now." I read it 3 times, didn't cry, didn't feel angry. I folded it and tucked it into my notebook as a quiet instruction between me and Grandma. That night, I received a short email from Mark and Laura. "Let's talk when you have time." I replied, "Everything by email. No visits. If you want to request a time, send the topic in advance." I didn't wait for a reply. I went to check the back room, the neighbourhood confirmation letter, still pinned to the wall, the chore schedule with all boxes checked, and my 2 bowls still centred on the shelf. Chloe called me out to the kitchen for one last meal before moving. I set down another mug I had made in the empty spot beside hers, joking that if Thomas stopped by, there would already be a cup waiting. She said, "Go ahead and invite him. I'll be packing in my room." There was another knock at the door. Thomas had brought a small bundle of dried branches, asking if he could place them on the porch to make it look nice. I nodded. Ms. Alvarez passed by, the gate smiled and said, "Everything looks great." Chloe waved to her, then looked at me. "I'm heading out. Thank you for showing the way clearly." I helped her carry the suitcase to the door locked up and stood for a moment looking at the quiet yard. Inside, Thomas sat at the edge of the seat, not touching anything until I invited him. I poured tea into the mug I'd already set out, listening to the soft clink of ceramic meeting wood. I looked around my kitchen at the 2 bowls centered on the shelf and felt that everything was where it was meant to be. I no longer waited for someone to place me in the middle. My door opened to those who knew how to knock and I was exactly where I belonged. If you've been compared and pushed to the edges, hear me, you're not broken. You've just been in the wrong place for too long. Peace doesn't arrive overnight. It comes from small steps you can take today. A kind firm, an email instead of a spiraling argument, a notebook where you record what you've endured and what you choose to keep. Many people are helping themselves in simple ways, now booking a therapy session or calling a support line, practicing slow breathing when the heart races, taking a 15-minute walk to clear the mind, building a small safety fund so you can leave harmful spaces, moving tricky conversations into writing and finding a small group, a class, a club, a church, a gym where you're called by your right name. Setting boundaries isn't selfish. It's how you protect the best of you so there's something left for the people who deserve it. If you slip or step back, it's okay. Healing is a curve, not a straight line. Ask yourself each day, what one small thing will make me safer today? Maybe it's silencing someone who keeps poking at you, blocking an account, texting, I'll reply later, or simply eating a decent meal and going to bed early. And when you're ready, tell your story. When one person speaks, another feels less alone. If this ending touched you, I'd love to keep going together. Subscribe for more stories about boundaries, family, and healing, and share your experience in the comments. Maybe you'll be the right knock on the right door for someone out there.